What's up, everyone? I'm here, my NFL Week 5 DraftKings picks. Sorry we're getting this out a day late, but we're here nevertheless. As always, if you want to see my Week 4 recap video, you can look for that link in the description below. So let's go ahead and get to this week's picks. Okay, so moving into our stacks here. First up, I have Jacoby Brissett and T.Y. Hilton. And I have them on the screen because I like them in GPPs. Now, in terms of cash games, which is really what I want to focus on here, there's three cheap quarterbacks that are in play for just about everybody, I think, in cash. And that's Jacoby, which he's not really that cheap, but he's cheap enough, I think. And then you have the two cheapest guys on the slate, which is interesting, and Brian Hoyer and Josh McCown. It's really hard for me to pass up the cheapest guy on the slate facing the Cleveland Browns. But ultimately, I think whichever cheap quarterback you go with, you really have to think which opposing team that they are facing can move the ball the best. Okay, if you think that the Browns are going to be able to move the ball against the Jets and put up, at least 20 to 24 points, then of course go with McCown because he's going to throw the ball quite a bit probably. If you think Jacoby Brissett is going to be able to move the ball very successfully against the 49ers, then definitely go with Hoyer. I mean, if you take a look at some of the teams Hoyer's faced, he's faced some tough teams. I mean, the Cardinals. He went off against the Rams. He's faced the Seahawks on the road. He faced the Panthers. So he's faced some relatively tough defense. This might be the worst defense. No, not even might. This is the worst defense he has faced so far this season. So we'll see what he can do. So Brissett's in play for me in GPPs, as is T.Y. I suspect both of these guys, especially T.Y., is going to be pretty popular in cash games. But in terms of GPP, I think that these two guys could be a little bit contrarian in those type of contests. But right now, if I had to, play one of these three guys that I was just talking about, I'd probably go Hoyer, just because I think that the Colts actually have a chance to be able to move the ball pretty well. Even though Brissett is prone to making mistakes, I definitely think that he does have he's definitely a better quarterback than the other two guys I've been talking about. But I mean, none of them really have many weapons around them, so it's really just who can use those, average weapons the best, right? All right, so next up, I have Aaron Rodgers and Jordy Nelson, and this should not come as a surprise. If price was not an issue on the slate, these two guys would be the most popular players on the main slate, and with good reason. First off, Aaron Rodgers right now, he's 8.1K, the most expensive guy on the main slate. If the two running backs, Ty Montgomery and I believe it's Williams, if they do not play, I probably will play Aaron Rodgers in cash games. I'm just considering it that much, because what happens is, and the Packers did this a lot last year when all the running backs went down, they had to pull Ty Montgomery off of the wide receiver corps and had to move him into the backfield. They pretty much turned, instead of trying to run the ball for 4 or 5 yards to cut the first half, the first down distance in half, they basically started throwing the ball for 4 or 5 yards, right? And that's really going to bump up Randall Cobb and Jordy Nelson, especially if Davante Adams doesn't play, which, I mean, I can't imagine him playing, but he says he's on track to. I don't know. I don't think he's going to play. I think they're going to be very delicate with the situation, so to speak. So I don't suspect he's going to play. But if the two running backs do not play, and they're going to be sitting there with their third string running back, who is it, Aaron Jones or something like that, if they don't play, and Aaron Rodgers throws the ball 40+ times, he's going to score over 30 DK points. It's just going to happen. He's that efficient. And right now, even though Aaron Rodgers is the most expensive guy on the slate, he has a great points per dollar in terms of his projection. Right now, Josh McCown's projecting at 15 points at 4.5K. That puts him at a 3.44 points per dollar, which is the highest on the slate for quarterbacks. Then second, you have Aaron Rodgers. He's 8.1K, projecting at 26 points, but he's at 3.21 points per dollar. That's higher than Brian Hoyer, Flacco, Taylor, Jay Cutler, any of those guys. So just because he's super expensive does not mean he's not a good value. And I like Jordy, but honestly, you could play Aaron Rodgers by himself in cash games. I think that's perfectly fine in this particular situation if those two running backs do not play. And even if they do play, it's not going to scare me away that much. So right now, I do like Rodgers in cash games a lot. But I certainly understand if you want to go and play one of those three cheap guys that I talked about before. Also, I haven't even talked about it. Rodgers is a good play in GPPs. I don't think a lot of people are going to play him in cash just because he's so expensive. But in GPPs, I definitely think it makes sense as well if you can, find the right combination. I think that it makes perfect sense to stack him with Cobb and Jordy Nelson, or just Cobb. If Davante Adams doesn't play and the two running backs don't play, I wouldn't be surprised to see Randall Cobb actually get a few carries out of the backfield. So, don't be shocked if that happens. I don't think it's going to happen a ton, but certainly still can happen. So I think Aaron Rodgers is a great play this week. I mean, it's not, this is not, revolutionary here by any means, people, but he certainly should be in consideration for cash if you can get there and feel comfortable with your lineup. All right, so rounding out my stacks here, I have Jay Cutler and DeVante Parker. So I suspect that DeVante Parker is actually going to be pretty popular. I think you could play him in cash games if you wanted to. I don't think you need to, but he certainly is in play there. Like right now, I'm very interested to see what the game total is going to open up at, because right now I've looked around quite a bit. I haven't seen Vegas release a game total yet. I think they're still waiting on whether or not Mariota is going to play. It looks like he's going to play. I think he's practiced the past 2 days. So obviously tomorrow we'll probably definitely find out. Usually if a guy practices on Friday, he's going to play in the game. So, if Mariota does play, I'd be shocked to see this game total open up at anything under 45. If it opens up at anything over 46, I'm going to be all over this game and stacking it like crazy, because, I can't believe this game isn't getting more talked up, because these are two of the worst defenses in the NFL, according to DVOA. You have the 29th overall ranked defense in the Miami Dolphins, and then you have the 31st overall ranked defense in the Tennessee Titans. And specifically talking about wide receiver twos right here. The Tennessee Titans are the 31st ranked DVOA defense against wide receiver twos. Well, DeVante Parker, although a lot of people think that he could be a future wide receiver one, right now you have to think that Jarvis Landry still demands that respect. Even though he's not a guy who's going to beat you over the top, he is a guy who is going to get targeted the most. This guy could, break 12, 15 targets any given time. And it looks like the Jay Cutler and the Dolphins are really trying to do that. And specifically the Dolphins are really just trying to prevent Jay Cutler from ruining the game at any given time. So that said, I like DeVante Parker a lot since they are so bad against wide receiver twos. They're also bad against tight ends. You could stack this game like crazy on both sides of the ball. I think that this game could be a really big shootout. Especially down there in Miami. So I'm hoping I'm right here, but we never know if Mariota doesn't play for some reason, or maybe Mariota just isn't anywhere close to 100, and somehow that hamstring limits him from throwing the ball too well, which, I don't see why it would, but, just lots of variables, but still, this would be a really good game to target in GPPs. All right, moving into running backs here, and you should not be too surprised to see Le'Veon Bell on your screen right now. This dude is just a killer play this week. I played him a little bit every single week waiting for that breakout game, and we finally had it last week. He went off, and now everybody's back on him, and the price has gone back up to 9,500 here, and I'm still going to try to force him into cash games because this is probably the best matchup he's had so far. Although Jacksonville is dominant at stopping the pass, they are very, very vulnerable against the rush. I talked about these numbers last week, and I had a Jaguars fan call me out saying that, oh, those numbers are wrong, they're misleading. They've been, beaten up because of how bad the offense is. And then last week we saw the Jets just run all over them. Now, granted, Bilal Powell did have kind of a play dead touchdown for 75 yards, which was a little bit fluky, I will say that. But we still saw Elijah McGuire run down their throats. And, they weren't playing dead. He was just running right around people. So, this is obviously a big issue with this Jacksonville team. So, if you want to attack this Jacksonville defense, it's obviously going to be on the ground. I also briefly want to touch on Ezekiel Elliott because, everybody's going to be trying to play both of these guys probably in their cash lineup. And I think that's a good play. We see here that Green Bay is definitely vulnerable against the pass-catching running back, which Ezekiel Elliott really isn't known for, but last week he did get his second career receiving touchdown. The Packers are very vulnerable against the receiving running back. They're 31st in DVOA in terms of that stat there. So we could see Ezekiel Elliott get a little bit more involved in the passing game than usually he does. So if you want to play both of them, I think that it definitely makes sense. It's going to be a little bit tricky in cash games if you want to go with Rodgers at your quarterback position and then play these two guys. But if you're going to go cheap at quarterback, playing these two guys is definitely in play. And it's definitely should be in consideration for you. All right, so next up I have Carlos Hyde. And at 6.9K, he's priced really interestingly. I think it's really fair, actually. He's not too cheap to where every single person is going to be on him. He's not too expensive to where, he's just unplayable at that price. So yeah, I don't mind him, even in cash. The Colts have just not been very good against the run this season. Really, the Colts are just a subpar defense all around. They're 26th in overall DVOA, 24th against the pass, 23rd against the run, 24th against the pass catching running back. I mean, they're 24th against wide receiver 2s, 21st against tight ends. They are top 10 against wide receiver 1s, which you would think Vontae Davis would have a little bit to do with that, but he hasn't played the first handful of games of the season. And I think I saw a stat somewhere that, the past 2 games, or the one game he has played or whatever it is so far this season, there was 5 passes thrown his way. All of them were receptions, and he gave like over 100 receiving yards. So we can't even say that. So they've actually been okay against wide receiver 1s, even without Vontae Davis. So that's a little bit interesting. But this is a guy who's going to get at least 4 targets a game. In fact, he's only had 1 game where he's had less than 6 targets. He's a guy who's going to get likely 20 plus touches. He only had 2 games so far this season that he has not had at least 20 touches. That was week 1 against Carolina, week 2 on the road against Seattle, and he still put up a pretty good day against Seattle there. So, I think it's a pretty good play. I think the one thing that, makes me a little bit hesitant to not lock him in is that he was limited at practice. He played through this little hip injury last week. He was questionable, still played all right as well, still had over 21 touches and had 14.5 DK points. But I don't know, if the injury really scares you, I completely understand, but if it doesn't, it's one of those things. I think he's in play to be an RB2, especially if you just want to pay up for one of the expensive running backs and then try to look in this middle tier. There's not many guys that are super jumping off the board to me, but I think Hyde is definitely in play. All right, moving to our third running back here, and that's going to be Duke Johnson. Now, the one thing about Duke Johnson you need to know, and I think he's going to be relatively popular this week, actually, which is interesting. I haven't played him a ton, but I have played him the past 2 weeks, and both of those games he's actually put up 20 DK points in each of the last 2 games, and he still has not come up in price. He's still sub 5K. He's facing the Jets. It's pretty well documented that this Jets team was thought to be one of the worst teams in the NFL coming into this season. They snuck away with a couple of wins here and there. Really whether or not you're going to play Duke Johnson once again comes down to what you think the other team is going to do. If you think the Jets win this game, Duke Johnson's probably going to be in play, because when the game's close and they're in obvious passing down situations, you have to think that Duke Johnson is going to be on the field. This guy had 5 targets week 1, 6 targets week 2, week 3, 7 targets, last week 10 targets. Throwing that in that he had at least 1 rushing touchdown each of the last 2 weeks. He's just a guy who's not going to get a ton of targets, a ton of touches. Last week he had 10 targets, but only had 13 total touches. So he's not going to run the ball a ton. But last 2 weeks we've seen he's been pretty efficient with the few amount of attempts he's had on the ground. Like I said, a rushing touchdown in each of the last 2 games. So I don't know. If you think the Browns win this game, I think Isaiah Crowell is in play. I said this a couple weeks ago against the Colts, and he let down. Crowell has not played well so far this season. But at 4,700, if you think the Browns win this game and you think they win it by handily, or at least will be in the red zone a lot or whatever, Crowell should be in play. The reason that Crowell has not put up a good fantasy day so far this season is because the Browns have trailed more than any team in the NFL up to this point. I actually like the Browns to win this game, so because of that, I'm only going to play Duke Johnson in GPPs. Because if the Browns do win this game, you have to figure that Crowell likely will have the bigger role. But, who knows? Both of these teams are just not very good. But, it could be a game where we see a lot of points. I just don't know what to think of this game. It's a pick 'em right now. If I had a gun to my head, I actually think I'd go Browns because of the home team. Kaiser's looked, up and down so far. We'll see. I just think the Browns have more weapons, which sounds crazy, but I just think they do offensively. So we'll see, but right now this is an interesting GPP play for me. All right, so next up I have Randall Cobb, and I touched on him briefly when I was talking about the Aaron Rodgers and Jordy Nelson stack, but once again, at 6.7K, I do think that price is a little bit steep, but they've obviously priced him up considering whether or not Davante Adams is going to play. And the best case scenario for Randall Cobb is that Jamal Williams and Ty Montgomery do not play along with Davante Adams. Looks like Jamal Williams will probably play practice in full today on Wednesday. So if he does play, I still think Cobb is a good play. He'll be used in the slot a lot, of course, and I think that Dallas is definitely a little bit vulnerable there. You always want to target them on the inside. So yeah, if we hear for sure that Davante Adams will not play, I suspect Cobb will be somewhat popular. I think his projection obviously will rise a little bit as well, closer to the 16 to 17 point range, I would assume. And I think he's very cash playable if that happens. The next guy I want to talk about is another player who I touched on briefly earlier, and that's Jarvis Landry. 5.8K, he's probably one of the cheaper guys who's projecting as well as he is right now at 16.5 points at 5.8K. I think he's in play for cash for me. You know, on these PPR sites, people think that Jarvis Landry is not in play because he has this really low ceiling but high floor. And to an extent, I guess I would agree, but at the same time, I disagree because this is a guy who had 15 targets in week 1. You know, he had 11 targets week 2, 7 targets last week. Last week was a little bit different. They played so poorly. It was just a weird game against the Saints last week in London. You know, I'm gonna throw that game out. But this week, I like them. You know, so because of that, I think that he's in play for me. You know, just because he doesn't have, you know, a really good ADOT right now. His average depth of target is like 6 yards, which is just astronomically low. But the thing for me is, like, if he's getting 10 plus targets a game, which right now he is averaging about that, like he's just going to have a game where he gets those, you know, 10, 11 receptions and has, you know, a 40-yard, you know, play in there. And that alone is all you need. Like, you don't need him to score a touchdown to have, you know, a great game and be worth it in cash and or GPPs. Now, the one thing about Landry here you need to know is, like, in cash games, I think Landry is a safer play, but in GPPs, like, Devontae Parker is obviously the better and more popular play, but this could be a spot where you could, you know, pivot off of Parker in GPPs and play Landry. The thing is here, like, you're just not going to see Parker and Landry have a big game together all that often. Like, just because we haven't seen Jay Cutler get unleashed and throw the ball 40 times yet. We just haven't seen that. And, you know, just kind of go full Jay Cutler, just gunslinging it around. We haven't seen that yet, and I don't suspect we're going to see that too much this season, especially in this matchup because the Titans love to stack the box. It's one of the reasons that they, you know, are one of the better rushing defenses right now in terms of DVOA. Because of that, they've been very vulnerable in the pass. Very vulnerable in the slot. Like, this is just a good spot for Jarvis Landry. I like him for close to 9 targets. Likely will catch most of those. If he can just have 1 or 2 20 to 30-yard receptions, like, he's going to kill value here and be a great cash game play. So right now, I am considering Jarvis Landry in cash. All right, so next up, I have Dez Bryant. And yeah, I'm really interested to see what you guys think, right? Because I've heard Dez Bryant get talked up a lot this week. He's just not a guy I play very often. Like, I don't play him or Dak Prescott very much. In fact, I don't think I've ever played Dez Bryant in cash games. But I am considering him this week because, you know, it does look like a pretty good spot for him. I mean, I don't really need to throw too many numbers at you here. The Packers' defense is just not very good. Now, they are better than last year. Granted, that's not saying much, but yeah, I mean, I still think the best play on the Cowboys is Ezekiel Elliott. But, you know, Dez is definitely in consideration for me. Let me know, do you think this is a good play or not? You know, for me, I just feel like he needs double-digit targets to really do much these days. Like, you know, he had 9 targets week 1, only put up 6 points. Week 2 against Denver, he had 16 targets, was able to salvage with that touchdown reception, put up 18 DK points. Week 3 only had 2 targets. Week 4, 13 targets, 5 receptions, 98 receiving yards, only put up 14.8 fantasy points. Like, I just think that Dez Bryant is a trap play here. Like, I just do not think he's that good of a play. I may end up playing him because I do think 6,500 is a little bit too cheap in this matchup, which appears to be heading for, like, shootout territory. That said, like, I'm just not overly thrilled to play it. Let me know, do you think Dez is a good play this week? All right, so moving to tight ends and defense here. This week, I'm going with the chalk here. Austin Seferian-Jenkins was really popular last week. I ended up fading him, went Evan Ingram instead. Ingram actually did outperform Seferian-Jenkins, I believe, but this week, facing off against the Browns here, I think he's underpriced. I think that they have committed fully to him now. They just released Will Tye. I think this is a spot that, you know, you have to play Jenkins. I mean, the Browns are just not good against tight ends. 27th in DVOA against tight ends. They just gave up a touchdown to Tyler Kroft last week. In fact, they actually may have given up 2 touchdowns to Kroft. Yeah, they actually gave up 2 receiving touchdowns to Tyler Kroft last week. Tyler Kroft. Tyler Kroft, people. Like, I just can't stress it enough. Like, the dude only had 5 targets the first 2 weeks, and he caught 2 for touchdowns in this game, in the most recent game. So I just blows my mind how bad this team is against tight ends. Like, I mean, I don't know if that's, you know, something in the scheme or they're just really that bad with their linebacking core and you know, in red zone defense or what. But Severian Jenkins is not a bad play at all. You know, 3.5K, like I said, I think he's a little bit underpriced. He's going to be the chalk this week, but I think it's one of those positions that you can just eat the ownership because it's the right play this week. All right, so next up, I'm considering Evan Ingram once again this week. At 4K, a little bit more than I want to pay for him, but he is facing this Chargers defense that so far this season, they haven't been awful, but they've definitely been vulnerable in the middle of the field, right? Especially against tight ends. They're actually 30th in DVOA against tight ends. The Giants actually have an implied team total of 24 points right now, which is actually pretty high on this particular slate. They're going to be at home. So I think this is not a bad spot for Evan Ingram. Looks like a lot of people want to play Odell and Sterling Shepard and guys like that. And for me, I think Evan Ingram is actually in play again. Probably only going to play him in GPPs because I definitely would rather play Jenkins in cash games. But for only $500 more, it's not a bad pivot. I also don't mind Benjamin Watson, but he didn't practice today. So definitely keep tabs on that. If he practices tomorrow, I do not mind Ben Watson. I'm definitely scared to play anybody on the offensive side of the ball for the Ravens. That said, you know, he could have a pretty good game here. Raiders aren't very good against tight ends either. And the Raiders defense as a whole has just not been very good so far this season. So it would also be a really, really good pivot off of Jenkins because I suspect that Jenkins is not only going to be the highest owned in terms of cash game, but also pretty highly owned in GPPs as well. All right, so finishing up here with a defense, we have the Cincinnati Bengals. Defense on this main slate is kind of thin. Like, there's no one team that appears to be super chalky, but I don't mind the Bengals. I'm not overly thrilled about 3.3K, but you know, they're facing the Bills. They're at home. The game total is low. I think that the Bills have a pretty high probability for turning the ball over, but more than anything, I think that Tyrod Taylor does take some sacks. We've seen some times where he tries to scramble. It's just not there. He tries to make something out of nothing sometimes when he really should just kind of throw the ball away or something along those lines. So we could see a couple sacks here. The Bengals defense certainly is not bad. So I like the Bengals for a handful of sacks and maybe a pick here and there. The Bills have really kind of been overachieving in my opinion. I definitely don't think the Bills are as bad as we thought they were going to be for sure. I mean, they've beat some pretty solid teams here these past 2 weeks against the Broncos and the Falcons, but I definitely think this could be kind of a week where we see the Bills get back down to reality. So I think the Bills are a good team to pick on here this week. All right, so that's going to do it for this week's video. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave it a like. Also, be sure to check out my sleeper/value picks. Once it gets uploaded, there will be a link in the description below. Usually that gets uploaded Friday night. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitch as I should be live streaming Saturday night and kind of doing my final like overview of the entire slate. So be sure to check that out as well down below. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next one. Later.